Arsenic Village, The Nagyrév Murders. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. Along the Great Hungarian Plain, where the land lies wide and level and the river bends through reed beds and farmland, death did not need a reason. People died of fevers, spoiled food, bad water, accidents, childbirth, winter hunger, summer heat. They died quickly, and they died slowly, and most of the time nobody wrote down much more than a date and a name, if that. In the Tisza, a small district enclosed by the Tisza and Koros rivers, death was not rare enough to be remarkable. Households were tight units of labor and survival. The harvest decided whether a family ate well or poorly. A man's drinking could drain a house as surely as floodwater. An old body that could no longer work still had to be fed. A sick body still had to be carried through. Women kept the engine running, cooking, washing, nursing, birthing, burying, raising children, walking the same paths to neighbors' houses with a pot or a cloth or a message. A village could know everything about everyone and still live with things it could not name. That is how this story begins, not with poison, but with the kind of daily pressure that turns a house into a sealed room. The Tisza in the early 20th century was rural, poor, and lightly serviced by the state. A resident doctor was not a given. Police presence was distant. Courts existed, but they were not close enough to feel like protection. If a marriage was violent, it was private. If a household was cruel, it was family business. If an elderly relative became demanding, degrading, impossible, it was still the daughter-in-law's duty to cope. If a husband drank and beat and brought terror home, the expectation was endurance. Endurance is celebrated until it collapses. The crimes later associated with Nagyrév did not announce themselves as a catastrophe at the time they were happening. They were absorbed into routine. Men fell ill with stomach pain and vomiting and weakness, symptoms common enough to be dismissed. A short illness followed by death was not unusual in villages where disease and malnutrition were familiar. A burial did not automatically trigger suspicion. It triggered work, feeding mourners, washing sheets, returning to the fields. For years, these deaths were explained as illness, fate, or bad luck. Then, in June 1929, 2 anonymous letters reached the gendarmes in Tisza. The letters did not speak in rumors. They named households. They named relationships. They accused specific women of poisoning specific men who were already buried. They offered a kind of certainty that the villages had kept in fragments, the sense that something had been happening quietly for a long time. When questioning began, some of the accused did not deny everything. Some confessed. Names spread through statements, and one name in particular, Zuzana Fazekas, a midwife from Nagyrév, appeared again and again. Another midwife, Balint Sordas, was also identified early. The case widened beyond one village and into a region. Exhumations followed. The dead were asked to speak in the only way they could. Arsenic was found in bodies that had been buried as natural deaths. Dozens of victims were confirmed by forensic findings. The true total has never been fixed with certainty and has been repeated in later retellings in numbers that do not always agree with one another. The legal record, like all records of domestic crime investigated late, is uneven. Some acts could be proven, others could not. Some women were convicted, others were acquitted, many deaths remained suspected rather than legally resolved. The story traveled fast once it escaped the villages. It acquired a name, the Angel Makers, that made it portable. It also made it simpler than the record allows. A label can turn people into symbols, and symbols are easier to condemn than lives. This manuscript aims for the opposite. It stays close to what can be established, and it is careful about what cannot. It does not treat one person as a single source for an entire region's violence. It does not ask the reader to accept a neat total where none exists. It does not rely on shock to hold attention. The true horror here is quieter, how long something can persist inside ordinary life when illness provides cover, when household privacy is treated as sacred, and when early warning is treated as inconvenience. The women involved were not one kind of woman. Some were abused. Some were calculating. Some were exhausted beyond language. Some acted once. Some acted more than once. Some named others. Some were named by others. Some were punished, some were not. The men who died were not one kind of man. Some were violent. Some were old and dependent. Some were obstacles in inheritance disputes. Some were simply in the wrong place inside the wrong household at the wrong time. Children and infants appear too, breaking any easy attempt to frame the poisonings as a straightforward revolt against male brutality. This is why the story cannot be told honestly as a parable. It can only be told as a record of a region where domestic life carried pressure that had no sanctioned release, where care and control sat side by side, and where a poison that imitated illness could be used without a raised voice. The poisonings ended when graves were opened and the state moved in. What preceded them, and what followed them, was ordinary life, exactly like the kind that allows extraordinary harm to go unchallenged for years. Chapter 1. The region between rivers. The Tisza is defined first by water. It lies in the heartland of the Great Hungarian Plain, enclosed by the Tisza River and the Koros rivers, a low landscape of floodplain, fields, reeds, and long distances made longer by mud and weather. In warm months the air carries insects. In wet seasons tracks soften and cartwheels cut deep. In winter the cold is sharp and work does not stop simply because the light is thin. Villages here were shaped by farming and by what farming demands: early rising, seasonal urgency, the constant management of animals, stores, tools, and bodies. A household was an economic unit. It was also a prison, depending on who held power inside it. Nagyrév was one village among others, Tisza, Tisanoka, and smaller settlements scattered across the district. From the outside they could appear interchangeable: low houses, yards, outbuildings, kitchens that served as the center of the home. From the inside each village held its own hierarchies, feuds, loyalties, and the long memory of who had slighted whom, who owed money, who had married well, who drank, who beat, who endured. What unified them was not character. It was structure, household life and control. In early 20th century village life, land was power. A family's survival depended on its ability to work land and keep what it produced. Property was not just a possession, it was leverage. Older men often retained control of land until death, delaying division among sons and keeping daughters-in-law under authority. A young couple might live in the older generation's home, laboring on land they did not own, raising children in rooms they did not control. The household could be crowded and tense even in good years. In bad years it became volatile. Women carried the bulk of domestic labor. They cooked, cleaned, raised children, and cared for the sick and old. They also worked fields, animals, seasonal jobs, whatever the household required. Their day did not have an end point. It shifted from one form of labor to another. The arrangement created dependence. A woman could be indispensable to the household's functioning and still have little authority within it. If she was beaten, her bruises belonged to the family, not the state. If she tried to leave, she risked her children, her standing, her shelter, and in some cases her life. A violent marriage did not guarantee intervention. It guaranteed silence. Illness as a normal condition. When death later became central to the story, it was important that illness already belonged to daily life. A stomach sickness could come from spoiled food, contaminated water, influenza complications, alcohol abuse, overwork, infections untreated because no doctor came in time. Vomiting, diarrhea, fever, weakness, these were not exotic symptoms. They were part of the human landscape. People nursed each other through them because nursing was what they did. This meant a household could care for a dying man in full view of neighbors without anyone being able to say, with certainty, that anything unnatural was happening. A man could complain that his drink tasted strange and still be dismissed as irritable, drunk, delirious, or difficult. The dying often do not get believed. The sick room was a social space. Women came and went with broth and tea. Children hovered and were shooed out. Someone fetched brandy, not because it was medicine in any scientific sense, but because it was comfort and habit. The door might be open to neighbors. That openness did not prevent harm. It could conceal it by distributing responsibility into a crowd. This is one of the reasons the later investigations struggled. The method, whatever it was in each case, did not need secrecy. It needed only normal life. Midwives and informal medicine. In villages without reliable medical services, midwives held authority by necessity. A midwife was not only present at births. She dealt with miscarriages, postpartum illness, women's ailments, and domestic emergencies. She was accustomed to blood and pain and the hidden life of bodies. She moved between homes without attracting attention. Her presence in a household at night or during illness did not look suspicious. It looked normal. This matters because the case that later erupted across the region became inseparable from the role of midwives, both their access and the way their authority could be interpreted as influence. In Nagyrév, one midwife would later become a focal name, Zuzana Fazekas, known locally as Auntie Zutzi. Her birth name was Zuzana Ola. She is remembered now as a central figure, but the record is uneven. Much of what is said about her comes from others after fear had entered the villages. She died before she could be tried and questioned, leaving a gap that later retellings filled with certainty. Another midwife, Balint Sordas, appears early in accounts of the investigation. Her presence is a reminder that the practice was not confined to one person or one household. The region did not require a mastermind for harm to spread. It required only a method that fit the conditions: war, return, and household strain. The First World War altered village households in ways that did not always heal when the fighting ended. Men left. Some did not return. Some returned injured. Some returned hardened, unstable, or dependent. Work was disrupted. Women carried entire households alone or with the help of other women. Then the men came back, reclaiming authority in homes that had continued without them, often with new resentments and new patterns of violence. In a poor rural region, a disabled man could become not only a body in need of care but a reminder of lost labor and lost prospects. Care is not only physical. It is economic. It reorganizes a household around a burden that cannot be admitted as a burden without moral cost. These strains did not create murder. They created pressure that narrowed choices. A place that did not feel watched. The state existed, but it did not sit inside the home. Village life was largely self-regulating. Authority often meant the notary, the church, and social consequence rather than constant official oversight. Courts and police were not a daily presence. When the law came, it came from outside and usually after the fact. This distance shaped what people believed was possible. A household could act in ways that would have been difficult to sustain under close surveillance. It could also suffer in ways that would have been harder to ignore in an urban setting with doctors, neighbors who did not share family ties, and officials who were closer. The Tsezug was not lawless. It was simply not closely observed. The slow accumulation of ordinary deaths. In later years, the story would be told as though it began with poison. It did not. It began with deaths that were treated as ordinary. A man's illness could be seen as his own weakness. A husband's collapse could be blamed on drink. An old man's decline could be blamed on age. A sick child's death could be blamed on fate. Each explanation was plausible enough to close the matter. Over time, in some households, death became a practical endpoint to problems that had no lawful solution: violence that would not stop, authority that would not loosen, care that never ended, shame that threatened to destroy a family's standing, mouths that could not be fed. This is the threshold where the story becomes dangerous, not because the threshold is rare, but because it is recognizable. Many societies have households where suffering is private and endurance is demanded. What differs is whether anything interrupts the moment when endurance turns into action. In the Tsezug, interruption came late. The letters that forced a beginning. In June 1929, 2 anonymous letters reached the gendarmes in Tissikert. The writer or writers named particular families and particular deaths. They accused women of poisoning men who had already been buried. They forced private suspicion into official language. The letters did not prove anything on their own. What they did was compel the state to look at a region it had not watched closely and to consider the possibility that ordinary rural death had been carrying an extraordinary pattern. Once questioning began, the case opened rapidly. Confessions appeared. Names spread. Exhumations followed. But that belongs to the next movement of the story. For now, it is enough to understand what the letters disrupted. They disrupted a district defined by its rivers and its routines, where illness offered cover, where household privacy was treated as sacred, and where the labor of care gave certain people both proximity and power. The poisonings did not require darkness. They required only a place where ordinary life was heavy enough to hide what was being done inside it. Chapter 2: Women's Lives, Marriage, Violence, and No Exit. In the Tsezug villages, a woman's life was not divided neatly into public and private. Most of it took place inside work that was both. The household was a private space, but it was also the place where survival was produced. Cooking, washing, nursing, mending, raising children, feeding animals, tending gardens, helping in the fields, none of it was optional, and none of it could be postponed for long. A woman could be exhausted in ways that did not look dramatic from the outside. Exhaustion was not a crisis. It was a baseline. Marriage was supposed to stabilize life. Often it did the opposite. Marriage as an economic structure. A village marriage was not only companionship. It was labor management and property strategy. Households depended on workers. A wife brought labor into a home. She also brought children, and children meant future workers and future security. In families with land, marriage decided who would inherit and who would remain dependent. Where a young couple lived mattered as much as who they were. In many households, a bride moved into her husband's family home. This placed her under the authority of older family members, especially a mother-in-law and the household patriarch. The household could be crowded, several generations, multiple couples, children, sometimes siblings who had not yet married. Privacy was thin. Surveillance was constant, but it was family surveillance, not state oversight. In such a structure, conflict did not have a clean exit. It stayed in the same rooms. A woman who had married into a hostile household could not simply walk away without consequences. Leaving could mean losing children, losing shelter, losing access to work and food, and losing reputation in a community where reputation decided whether anyone would help you. A husband had legal and social advantage. A wife had duty. The accepted presence of violence. Violence inside marriage was not necessarily treated as scandal. It was often treated as unfortunate but private. A man's drinking was common enough to be normalized. A man's anger could be excused as stress, temperament, bad fortune, or men's business. A woman with bruises might be pitted quietly but not defended publicly. Intervention risked becoming the next conflict. In small villages, conflict does not spread outward, it spreads inward, into the household of anyone who speaks. This creates a pattern. Violence becomes something everyone knows and no one names. When the later poisonings were investigated, domestic violence appeared in testimony as background rather than center. A husband who beat his wife might be mentioned as motive, but the beating itself had rarely generated official attention. The law arrived when the husband died, not when the wife was struck. This shaped women's calculations. It taught the same lesson repeatedly: suffering could be endured indefinitely, and complaining did not guarantee protection. Care labor, the hidden trap. Even in peaceful marriages, the burden of care could become a trap. Illness did not remove responsibility. It multiplied it. An elderly father-in-law who could no longer work still expected to be fed, cleaned, and obeyed. A disabled husband required nursing, constant attention, sometimes humiliation of the carer. A sick child demanded time a mother did not have. In households with little money and no external services, care was not shared by institutions. It was absorbed by women. Care was not recognized as labor by the state. It was treated as natural female duty. This meant it could not be refused without moral condemnation. A woman could be trapped not only by violence but by obligation: to feed a man who insulted her, to clean a body that could no longer control itself, to be awake through the night while still expected to work at dawn, to carry the weight of another person's decline inside a house where nobody offered relief. In such conditions, resentment grows quietly. Resentment is not unusual. What matters is what happens when resentment is coupled with impossibility, when there is no lawful path to change. Divorce and the cost of leaving. Divorce existed, but it was not an easy or common solution in rural life. It carried social stigma. It required money. It required a willingness to break with family authority and village expectation. It threatened a woman's reputation, which threatened her survival. Even if a woman left her husband physically, she did not leave the village's memory. She carried the label of failure, defiance, or shame. Children made leaving harder. A woman without independent income risked losing her children or being unable to feed them. A woman who tried to take children could be accused of tearing the family apart. In households where property was controlled by the husband's family, a woman who left could lose access to everything she had built through years of labor. This is where no exit becomes literal. Not because leaving was impossible in every case, but because leaving often meant stepping into a different kind of danger: hunger, homelessness, sexual vulnerability, social isolation, and in some instances revenge. The safest path could be to stay. Staying does not mean safety. Inheritance pressure and the patriarch's hold. Land inheritance created another form of entrapment. Older men often controlled property until death. They delayed dividing land among sons, keeping adult children dependent. A daughter-in-law might labor for years on land she did not own, under a man who could threaten her shelter with a word. If she challenged him, she challenged the household structure. This mattered because death was one of the few forces that could change the distribution of power. A patriarch's death could trigger inheritance. A husband's death could free a woman from violence, from sexual obligation, from economic drain, and from the authority of his family. In some circumstances, it could also enable remarriage, which offered another chance at stability. This does not mean most women wanted their husbands dead. It means the system made death a door where law offered few. The social discipline of womanhood. A woman's behaviour was watched. Not by officials, but by neighbours. Village life enforced conformity through reputation. A woman who fought back could be labelled unstable. A woman who complained could be labelled disloyal. A woman who refused to care for an elderly relative could be labelled monstrous. A woman who sought sex outside marriage could be labelled immoral. A woman who wanted to leave could be labelled selfish. Social discipline created quiet compliance. This compliance was reinforced by religion and custom, but the deeper force was practical. A woman who lost reputation lost support, and support was survival. How solutions form inside a sealed room. In a household where a woman is trapped, her world narrows. She thinks in terms of what can be done without invoking authorities who have never protected her. She thinks in terms of what can be done inside the home, using objects already present, using routines already expected of her. She thinks in terms of solutions that do not require public confrontation. A method that fits these conditions does not need to be invented as murder. It can be framed as relief, as quiet correction, as a way to stop violence, as an end to suffering, as removal of an obstacle. This is how moral boundaries erode. Not through ideology, but through repetition of unbearable days. When later testimony described women poisoning husbands or relatives, it often sat alongside descriptions of life that had already been brutal. Some husbands were violent. Some were exploitative. Some were simply burdens in a household already close to collapse. Some victims were not violent at all. They were dependent, inconvenient, in the way. The record does not support a single motive, and it does not allow moral simplicity. But it does support the reality of narrowing options. The limits of sympathy. It is tempting to read this region's women as either victims or monsters. The case resists both. A woman can be abused and still commit murder. A woman can be trapped and still act with calculation. A woman can be exhausted beyond language and still choose a solution that ends another life. Understanding the conditions does not transform the act into justice. This must be held plainly because the story includes victims who cannot be explained away as aggressors, elderly men, sick men, and children. A system that traps people can still produce cruelty. A lack of exit can still produce acts that are unforgivable. The point is not to excuse. The point is to understand how the household became the stage on which death could be used as a tool. What the state did not see. If the state had looked closely at domestic violence, it might have seen the pressure building. If it had treated repeated illness and death as something worth investigating, it might have interrupted the pattern. If it had provided meaningful rural medical oversight, it might have made disguised poisoning harder to sustain. If it had offered women protection and lawful exits, it might have reduced the appeal of private solutions. It did none of these things early enough. Instead, the state largely accepted the household as a self-contained unit capable of regulating itself. In the Tsezug, regulation was often achieved not through law but through endurance, and endurance has limits. The quiet precondition. Before arsenic is even named, before a grave is opened, before a letter is written, the quiet precondition of this story is already in place. A region where suffering is private. A household where power is uneven. A woman whose labor is mandatory. A system that demands endurance and calls it virtue. In such a place, the most dangerous methods are not those that require violence in public. The most dangerous methods are those that can be carried out inside the routines a woman is already expected to perform. The kitchen. The sick room. The cup offered as care. That is how, in the Tsezug, death could become domestic long before anyone outside the villages had a reason to notice. Chapter 3: Midwives, Medicine, and a Poison That Looked Like Illness. In the Tsezug, medicine was not a building you visited. It was a person who came to you. A village might go weeks without seeing a doctor. A doctor might cover multiple settlements, arriving late, if at all, and often only when a family could pay or when a case was already beyond help. For most illnesses, people relied on what they had: home remedies, experience, neighbors' advice, and the women whose work had always sat closest to blood and pain. This is where the midwife's authority begins. The midwife as the closest thing to a clinic. A midwife was not only summoned for birth. She attended miscarriages and stillbirths. She dealt with hemorrhage, infection, fever, and postpartum collapse. She was called when a woman could not stop bleeding, when a baby would not breathe, when a wife was in pain she could not name aloud, when a household needed someone who was used to bodies failing. She was also present at life stages where shame and secrecy were common: unwanted pregnancies, suspected infidelity, illness that carried stigma, injuries that did not come from accidents. Even when she said little, her presence gave a household a story to tell, that the situation was being handled. In villages shaped by hard work and limited oversight, this authority mattered more than any formal credential. A midwife's knowledge was practical. It was proven in kitchens and bedrooms, not in lecture rooms. She was respected not because she was official in the modern sense, but because she was necessary. That necessity gave her access. Zsuzsanna Fazekas, what can be said without legend? Zsuzsanna Fazekas, born Zsuzsanna Ola on May 20, 1861, served as midwife in Nagyrév. She was known locally as Auntie Zootsie. Her married name, Fazekas, is the name that appears in testimony and later accounts. Little survives in the record about her childhood or formal training. Most of what is said about her comes from others after the investigation began in 1929, when fear and accusation had already entered the villages. This must be stated plainly because it shapes everything that follows. When a person is accused after a scandal breaks, testimony does not arrive in a calm environment. It arrives in a climate where people are trying to explain themselves, protect themselves, or redirect blame. When that accused person dies before trial, the court cannot test the statements against contradiction. Fazekas died on July 19, 1929, reported as suicide by poison. Her death removed the most frequently named figure from examination and left her as a fixed point in the public imagination, a midwife with access, knowledge, and an alleged role that could no longer be disputed in court. More than one midwife, more than one channel. Early confessions did not name only Fazekas. Another midwife, Balint Sordas, was also named in the initial wave of statements. This matters because it undermines any neat belief that one woman created the practice. It points to something less dramatic but more believable, that knowledge and substances moved through more than one person, and that people had multiple avenues for advice, supply, and reassurance. In a region where women's lives overlapped through births, illness, and mutual labor, a method did not need a mastermind. It needed circulation. And circulation is exactly what village life provides. A poison hidden in plain household life. Arsenic was not an exotic substance in early 20th century rural Europe. It appeared in products used to manage pests. It appeared in remedies of dubious safety. It appeared in materials sold through shops and pharmacies. It could be obtained and handled by ordinary people without attracting the attention a modern reader might expect. The detail that recurs in testimony and later reconstructions is the use of flypaper as a source. Flypaper was a domestic object. It hung near windows. It sat in kitchens. It was meant to catch insects. In some forms it contained arsenic compounds, and women later described extracting poison by soaking or boiling strips of flypaper and collecting the residue. The method is important not because it is clever, but because of how well it fits the domestic setting. No special equipment was needed beyond what a woman already used to cook. No public purchase of poison was required if the source was a household product. No act of force was required. The result could be mixed into food, drink, or medicine under the cover of care. It was a method designed by convenience rather than theater. Why it worked as concealment. Arsenic poisoning can resemble common illness. It can produce stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, collapse, symptoms familiar in communities where disease, hunger, and contaminated food were regular threats. This resemblance mattered. A sick man could deteriorate at home without any requirement for a medical examination. A household could say he had caught a chill, eaten something bad, drunk too much, worked too hard, been unwell for weeks. These explanations were not suspicious on their own. They were plausible enough to close attention. Even when a death felt wrong, wrong was not proof. In the Tsezug, proof was rare. The state did not routinely investigate rural deaths. A burial ended the matter. This is why the later exhumations were so significant. They created proof after the fact, in bodies that had been buried as natural deaths. But before 1929, the absence of proof protected the practice. The midwife's power, access and language. If a woman wanted to end a husband's life, she needed 3 things. Access, which she already had. Opportunity, which domestic routine provided. Permission, which is what a midwife could supply without saying the word. A midwife did not need to hand over poison to influence a woman's decision. She could normalize the idea. She could speak in euphemism. She could imply that a husband's illness would be merciful. She could offer the kind of authority that transforms a private thought into an actionable plan. This is how power often operates in closed communities, not through orders, but through the shaping of what feels acceptable. Testimony later described midwives not only as suppliers but as advisors, women who knew how to speak to other women's desperation and reframe it as solution. Whether every detail of these descriptions is true in every case cannot be proven. What can be said is that enough defendants and witnesses believed it, and enough repeated the same claim, that midwives became central to how the region explained itself once the scandal broke. What the villages did with midwife blame. Once the investigation began, the midwife was a convenient center. A midwife is both inside and outside the household. She belongs to the women's world, yet she is not bound by one family's loyalties. She moves through multiple homes. She sees what others do not. If people need an origin story, someone who started it, someone who taught it, someone who sold it, the midwife fits the role. This does not mean the midwife was innocent. It means the role she occupied made her a natural focal point for a community attempting to turn a complex pattern into a single narrative that could be carried and condemned. Fazekas' death made this even easier. A dead woman cannot contest her own myth. The real point, a method that required no conspiracy. The most durable misunderstanding about the Tsezug poisonings is the belief that they required a coordinated ring. A practice can spread without coordination. If a woman hears that another woman ended a violent marriage and was not punished, the idea becomes conceivable. If she learns that a substance can be obtained from an ordinary household product, the barrier lowers further. If someone with authority, whether a midwife, a neighbor, a relative, speaks in a way that frames death as relief, the final barrier collapses. None of this requires meetings. It requires a shared environment. The environment in the Tsezug was one where women were expected to endure, where leaving carried heavy costs, where care labor could become endless captivity, and where the state was distant enough that private solutions felt more real than legal ones. Arsenic was not the cause. It was the tool that fit. The quiet danger of legitimacy. The most dangerous feature of this method was not that it was hidden. It was that it could be legitimized. A man could be treated at home. A midwife could be present. Neighbors could visit. A wife could appear devoted. A death could be mourned as illness. Everything looked familiar. This is why the practice could persist for years, not because villages were blind, but because the method wore the same face as care. In the next movement of the story, the state is forced to look at what had long been absorbed as ordinary. The investigation begins with letters and confessions, but it quickly becomes something else, a confrontation between domestic life and forensic proof. The dead are about to be asked to speak. And once they do, the villages can no longer hold the story inside the household. Chapter 4, The First Deaths That Felt Wrong. There was no single death that announced what was happening. The poisonings did not begin with panic or with a body that could not be explained. They began the way many things begin in villages shaped by hardship, quietly, and one household at a time. A man fell ill. He complained of stomach pain. He vomited. He weakened. He was nursed at home. He died. Nothing in that sequence demanded alarm on its own. Illness as explanation. In the Tsezug, illness was a familiar visitor. Food spoiled easily. Water was not always safe. Alcohol was common. Men worked hard, drank hard, and aged quickly. A sudden sickness followed by death could be attributed to any number of causes without raising suspicion. When a man became ill, the household did what it always did. Women took over the sick room. Food was prepared carefully. Neighbors visited. Someone might call for the midwife. A doctor was summoned only if the family believed the cost and delay were worth it, and often it was already too late by the time one arrived. The sick man's complaints were filtered through expectation. If he said his drink tasted strange, he might be dismissed as irritable or delirious. If he accused someone, he might be said to be confused. If he refused food, he might be coaxed or scolded. Dying men do not always sound reasonable, and reason is rarely extended to them when death feels inevitable. Death that reorganized a household. What began to feel wrong was not always the death itself, but what followed it. In some households, a man's death resolved tensions that had lasted for years. A violent husband was gone. An obstructive father-in-law no longer controlled the land. An abusive drinker no longer drained the household. The widow's circumstances changed quickly, authority shifted, inheritance moved, remarriage became possible. Neighbors noticed these changes. They noticed when a woman who had lived under fear became calmer. They noticed when land was divided sooner than expected. They noticed when a household that had struggled suddenly stabilized. None of this proved murder, but it planted unease. Patterns that could not be spoken. In villages, people recognize patterns long before they articulate them. Women noticed first, because women were present. They nursed the sick together. They exchanged stories quietly while washing sheets or bringing food. They compared symptoms. They remembered how long illnesses lasted. They remembered words spoken at bedsides. They noticed which men died quickly and which lingered, and how often the same complaints appeared before death. This knowledge remained fragmented. To assemble it into an accusation required certainty that no one possessed. To speak it aloud required safety that no one had. In a small village, an accusation does not end with the accused. It spreads outward, touching children, marriages, livelihoods. A woman who accused another woman of poisoning risked becoming the next target of suspicion, retaliation, or isolation. Silence was safer. Early rumors and quiet warnings. Before the investigation, warning took indirect forms. A woman might advise another not to eat or drink in a certain house. Someone might decline to sit alone at a sickbed. A neighbor might refuse to leave her child with a particular woman. These were not declarations. They were adjustments. Such warnings are almost invisible in official records, but they shape behavior. They show that unease existed even when speech did not. The problem with informal warning is that it protects individuals unevenly. It does not stop a practice. It only teaches people how to avoid it. The first named victims. When the investigation finally began in 1929, it reached back years. Men who had been buried long before were reclassified as suspected victims. Some names appear repeatedly in early case files: husbands who had died suddenly after domestic conflict, fathers and uncles whose deaths resolved inheritance disputes, men who had been nursed at home and buried without medical scrutiny. Among the earliest cases to attract official attention were those later named in the anonymous letters: the father and uncle of Laszlo Sabo, and the death associated with the household of Laszlo Madaras. These deaths had not been extraordinary when they occurred. They became extraordinary only when they were reread through accusation. This is an important distinction. The poisonings were not shocking when they happened. They became shocking when someone insisted on connecting them. Violence that never reached the law. In later testimony, domestic violence appears again and again as background. Some husbands beat their wives. Some humiliated them publicly. Some drank heavily and consumed household resources. Some threatened women with expulsion or with loss of children. These behaviors were known within villages. They were rarely prosecuted. This matters because it shaped how later deaths were interpreted. When a violent man died, grief could be complicated. Relief might exist alongside mourning. A woman's calm after a husband's death could be read as suspicious later, even if it was simply exhaustion ending. The absence of legal response to violence meant that violence itself became invisible in the record. When murder finally drew attention, the years that preceded it appeared only as motive, not as harm in their own right. The doctor who asked too early. At least one doctor in the region became suspicious before 1929. He observed a death that did not sit comfortably with illness and requested an exhumation. The request was refused. No grave was opened. The matter ended. This refusal did not make poisonings inevitable. It made them safer. It told the villagers that even when a professional suspected foul play, the system could choose not to look. It reinforced the belief that speaking carried risk and that nothing would change unless the cost of an action became too high. Confession before the storm. In another early case, a woman admitted to poisoning her mother. The confession was recorded. It did not trigger a wider investigation. It was treated as an isolated incident, an aberration, something that could be contained within one household's tragedy. This, too, sent a message. If a confession could be absorbed without consequence, then silence was not the only strategy. Knowledge could circulate without immediately provoking intervention. When ordinary becomes dangerous. By the time the anonymous letters were written, the poisonings had already become embedded in domestic life. They were not daily events. They were not constant. But they were frequent enough, and similar enough, that unease had spread through the women's world of kitchens and sick rooms. The danger was not that everyone knew. The danger was that enough people suspected, and still nothing happened. Ordinary death is powerful cover. It allows harm to pass unnoticed not because people are foolish, but because challenging it requires certainty, authority, and willingness to disrupt life. In the Tsezug, those things did not align until someone forced them to. The moment before exposure. Looking back, it is tempting to search for a point where intervention would have been obvious. There was no such point. There were only moments when someone might have spoken and chose not to, moments when someone asked and was refused, moments when death was explained because explanation was easier than doubt. The poisonings did not advance by leaps. They advanced by accumulation. One death accepted. Another explained. Another buried. By the time the pattern could no longer be denied, the pattern was already long established. The first deaths that felt wrong did not end the story. They taught the villages how much could happen quietly before anyone with power was forced to look. Chapter 5. Known Victims I, Husbands and Fathers. When the investigation reached backward into the past, it did not find strangers. It found men who had been known all their lives. They were husbands, fathers, uncles, men whose habits, tempers, illnesses, and authority had shaped the households in which they died. Their deaths had not been registered as crimes at the time. They had been absorbed into village life as endings that made sense, even when they left discomfort behind. Only later were they reclassified as victims. Death inside marriage. Many of the confirmed poisonings involved husbands. These were not men who died alone or unseen. They died in their own beds, in houses where they had lived for years, nursed by wives who were expected to tend them regardless of how they had been treated in life. The intimacy of marriage provided both access and explanation. Testimony later described husbands who drank heavily, who beat their wives, who withheld money, who humiliated women publicly, who returned from war injured and volatile. It also described husbands who were simply ill, weak, or demanding in ways that exhausted households already under strain. The record does not allow a single profile. What it does show is that marriage placed women in continuous proximity to men whose behavior they could not escape and whose decline they were required to manage. The Sobo case. Among the earliest deaths to be scrutinized were those connected to the Sobo household. The anonymous letter received in June 1929 accused the poisoning of both the father and uncle of Laszlo Sobo. These men had died at different times, under circumstances that had not prompted official concern when they occurred. Both deaths were later reopened. Exhumation revealed arsenic. In testimony, the deaths were described as following illness rather than violence. The men had been nursed at home. Their symptoms were consistent with stomach sickness. Nothing about their decline had forced intervention at the time. What made the case significant was not the manner of death, but the repetition within one family. A single unexplained death could be coincidence. Multiple similar deaths inside a household suggested pattern. Fathers-in-law and the weight of authority. A recurring figure in the case files is the father-in-law. These men often retained control of land and household decisions well into old age. They could be infirm and still powerful. A daughter-in-law might spend years caring for a man who controlled her living conditions, her work, and her future. Testimony described men who refused to divide property, who interfered in marriages, who insulted or punished women who challenged them. Their authority was legal, social, and economic. Their decline did not necessarily loosen it. In several cases, a father-in-law's death triggered immediate changes: land division, household restructuring, relief from daily supervision. These changes were noted later as suspicious, even if they had felt inevitable to those living through the years before. Violence that was never charged. Some of the men later identified as victims had reputations for violence. They were known to drink excessively. They were known to strike wives or children. They were known to terrorize households in ways that never reached official record. This violence matters not because it excuses murder, but because it explains why some deaths were not mourned in simple terms. When a violent man died, the household could experience conflicting emotions: grief mixed with relief, fear mixed with exhaustion. A widow's composure after such a death could later be read as evidence of guilt, even when it was the natural aftermath of years of fear ending. The law did not intervene when the violence occurred. It intervened when the violent man was dead. Illness as a closing argument. In nearly every case, illness was the explanation offered at the time of death. A husband complained of stomach pain. He vomited repeatedly. He weakened. He could not work. He died within days or weeks. These symptoms did not force suspicion in a region where disease was common and medical confirmation rare. The sick room became the final setting for many of these deaths. Wives prepared food and drink. Neighbors visited. Someone might call for the midwife. The presence of care acted as cover, even when care was the means. A dying man's accusations were rarely treated as reliable. Pain, fever, and fear make people sound unreasonable. A man who accused his wife of poisoning him could be dismissed as delirious or drunk. Once buried, his words had no force. Husbands who were not violent. Not all of the husbands who died were abusive. Some were ill for long periods. Some were disabled. Some were demanding in ways that drained households without overt cruelty. Some were simply in the way of a household's survival. These cases complicate any attempt to frame the poisonings as a direct response to violence alone. A woman might poison a husband who was not cruel because his illness consumed resources the family did not have. She might poison a man whose care would stretch on indefinitely, trapping her in nursing without relief. She might poison a man because his death would allow remarriage, land division, or escape from poverty. These motives are uncomfortable precisely because they are practical rather than emotional. The record's limits. The investigation relied heavily on exhumation and confession. Where arsenic was detected in a husband's remains, the court accepted poisoning. Where it was not detected, suspicion could linger without resolution. Soil conditions, burial practices, and the passage of time affected what could be proven. This means that the list of known victims is incomplete by design. Some husbands were confirmed victims. Others were suspected. Others may never have been identified at all. The absence of proof does not equal absence of act, but the court could act only where evidence survived. How households changed after death. One of the most telling features in many cases is what happened immediately after a husband's death. Widows remarried quickly. Households reorganized. Land was divided. Conflicts ended. These changes were not crimes. They were consequences. Later in court, they were sometimes presented as motive. At the time, they had been accepted as necessity. A woman with children and no independent income could not afford prolonged mourning. Survival required movement. This gap between lived necessity and later interpretation runs through the entire case. The danger of hindsight. Once the investigation reframed these deaths as murder, everything about them acquired new meaning. A calm widow became suspect. A quick remarriage became evidence. A household's relief became guilt. Hindsight is powerful, but it is not neutral. The men in these cases lived and died inside relationships that were already strained, violent, or exhausted. Their deaths ended those relationships. The law later stepped in and demanded a story that could be judged. What the law could not do was return to the moment before death, when illness looked ordinary and endurance still felt like the only option. Naming the dead. To list these men only as victims is to flatten their lives. They were people who drank, worked, beat, loved, withheld, aged, failed, and depended. Some inflicted harm. Some suffered it. Some did both. Their deaths were not interchangeable, even when the method was. What binds them together in this story is not who they were, but how they died, inside households that had learned to manage suffering privately, using a method that could hide inside care. These were the first victims to be named because they were the easiest to see once the pattern was forced into the open. They were not the only ones. Chapter 6, Known Victims 2, The Elderly and the Dependent. If the deaths of husbands could sometimes be explained through conflict, the deaths of elderly men and dependents resist that framing. These victims did not always strike, threaten, or drink. Some did. Many did not. What bound them together was not violence, but dependency. They were men who could no longer work, who required care that did not end, and who lived inside households where labor was already stretched thin. Their deaths were quiet, prolonged, and often absorbed without comment at the time they occurred. In the investigation that followed 1929, these cases proved some of the hardest to confront. Dependency as a permanent condition. Old age in the Tsezug was not cushioned by institutions. There were no nursing homes. No pension sufficient to remove a person from the household economy. An elderly man who could no longer work did not become neutral. He became a cost. Food had to be provided, clothing washed, bedding changed, bodies cleaned. When illness arrived, care intensified rather than replaced labor. The work fell almost entirely on women, wives, daughters-in-law. Care was not temporary. It could last years. For a woman already managing children, fields, animals, and a husband's demands, the addition of an immobile or chronically ill man could push a household past endurance. Complaining did not remove the burden. Refusing care was unthinkable. Violence was not always present, but obligation was relentless. This form of pressure rarely leaves marks that can be photographed or counted. It accumulates instead. Fathers and uncles who would not release control. Many of the elderly men later identified as victims retained authority long after their physical strength had faded. They controlled land. They controlled inheritance. They controlled household decisions. A daughter-in-law might spend years caring for a man who could no longer walk, while knowing that her labor would not translate into security until his death. Some men explicitly refused to divide land until the end, using property as leverage to enforce obedience. Testimony later described men who were humiliating, demanding, or degrading even in decline. Others were simply immovable, insisting on routines that exhausted those around them. Their authority did not require strength. It required structure. Illness that never resolved. In several cases, elderly men suffered from chronic illness rather than sudden collapse. They weakened slowly. They complained constantly. They required constant attention. Their decline did not produce a crisis moment that demanded outside intervention. It produced years of care that wore down the household. When these men finally died, their deaths were rarely surprising. They were expected. This expectation provided cover. A death that arrives on time is rarely questioned, even when the final illness accelerates unnaturally. When an old man who has been sick for years suddenly deteriorates and dies, it feels like conclusion rather than interruption. Confirmed poisonings among the elderly. Exhumations later confirmed arsenic in the remains of several elderly men. These were not deaths that had prompted suspicion at the time. They had been explained as the natural end of long decline. The discovery of poison forced a reinterpretation that unsettled both courts and communities. Unlike some husband cases, these deaths could not easily be framed as reactions to immediate violence. They required a different explanation, one rooted in exhaustion, resentment, and the belief that care had no endpoint. The court record reflects this discomfort. Testimony in these cases often lacks dramatic language. Women spoke of being tired, of not managing anymore, of wanting it to end. The language is practical, not emotional. It does not seek sympathy. It describes a decision made under pressure rather than rage. The moral weight of care. Caregiving carries moral expectation. A woman who tends an elderly man is praised. A woman who fails to do so is condemned. There is little space to admit hatred, resentment, or desire for escape without risking moral expulsion. This expectation creates a dangerous bind. A woman can endure indefinitely and be praised. She can collapse and be blamed. She cannot ask to stop. When later asked why she poisoned an elderly relative, a woman might struggle to articulate motive in terms that made sense to a court. He was old was not acceptable. I was exhausted was not a defense. The language of law does not translate the labor of care easily. As a result, these cases often appear thin in motive, even when the pressure behind them was immense. Dependence without affection. Not all caregiving relationships were softened by affection. Some elderly men had been harsh fathers. Some had abused authority for decades. Some had maintained control through fear rather than love. When these men became dependent, the emotional debt did not vanish. It inverted. The woman who had once been controlled now controlled food, drink, and medicine. The shift in power was quiet but complete. This inversion does not automatically produce violence, but it creates conditions where violence becomes possible without confrontation. How neighbors interpreted these deaths. At the time they occurred, the deaths of elderly men rarely caused alarm. Neighbors expected them. Priests buried them. Families mourned in appropriate ways. Relief might be felt privately, but it was not spoken. To speak ill of the dead was to invite judgment. Silence preserved reputation. It was only later, when poison was found, that neighbors revisited their memories, the timing, the sudden downturn, the way a woman's life changed afterwards. Memory, once reshaped, can feel like foresight. This is one of the dangers of retrospective judgment. The limits of proof. As with other victims, not every suspected poisoning among the elderly could be proven. Some graves yielded arsenic. Others did not. Inconclusive findings left families suspended between suspicion and uncertainty. A woman might live the rest of her life under a cloud without ever being charged. The court could punish only what could be demonstrated chemically and supported by testimony. Exhaustion, resentment, and despair were not evidence. Why these cases matter. The deaths of elderly and dependent men complicate every attempt to simplify the Nagyrév story. They cannot be explained solely through self-defense. They cannot be dismissed as revenge. They cannot be turned into moral fables. They force confrontation with a harder truth, that a system which offloads unlimited care onto individuals, without relief or support, creates conditions where killing can be framed as an end to labor rather than an act of hatred. This does not excuse the act. It explains how it becomes imaginable. A quieter category of victim. These men died without spectacle. They did not shout. They did not flee. They did not fight. They were fed. They were washed. They were tended. They were buried. Their deaths were among the easiest to hide and the hardest to speak about, both then and now. They sit at the center of the case's moral discomfort, because they reveal how violence can grow out of care itself when care has no boundary. They were not the last victims to be identified. The next group would force the courts and the public to confront something even more destabilizing, the deaths of children, where no argument about authority or exhaustion could fully explain what had been done. Chapter 7, Known Victims 3, Children and Infants. The deaths of children unsettled the case in a way nothing else did. Husbands could be framed as violent. Elderly men could be framed as burdens. Even these explanations, however uncomfortable, allowed the public to keep a sense of order, that the poisonings were a response to something done or demanded by the dead. Children offered no such order. They had not accumulated authority. They had not controlled land. They had not inflicted years of labor on others. Their deaths stripped the story of any remaining moral shelter. Childhood in the Tisezug. Childhood in the early 20th century Tisezug was precarious even without violence. Infant mortality was high. Many children died within days or weeks of birth from infection, malnutrition, or complications of childbirth. Some births were never formally registered. A child's death, especially in the first year of life, did not automatically prompt investigation or public mourning beyond the household. This context matters because it explains how child deaths could occur without suspicion. It does not explain why poison was used. Infants as misfortune. In testimony and court records, some infant deaths were initially described as weakness, sickness, or misfortune. Babies were said to have been born frail, unable to feed properly, or prone to sudden collapse. These explanations were accepted at the time because they matched experience. Only later, when exhumations were ordered, were some of these deaths reclassified as poisonings. This reclassification forced a reckoning. A death that had once been understood as tragic inevitability became an act. The distance between those two interpretations was vast, and it could not be bridged without confronting intent. The problem of unwanted children. Some of the children later identified as victims were unwanted. Poverty played a role. A household already struggling to feed existing children might view another mouth as disaster. Illegitimacy carried shame. A pregnancy could threaten a woman's standing, safety, or ability to survive within her marriage. Abortion was illegal and dangerous. Birth control was unreliable. A woman who could not carry another child without risking collapse had few lawful options. This does not make infanticide understandable in any moral sense. It explains why the question appears in the record at all. Testimony that resists repetition. Descriptions of child deaths in the case files are often brief and evasive. Women spoke less readily about these acts. Some denied them entirely. Some acknowledged poisoning without offering explanation. Some claimed the child was already sick. Some claimed the dose was meant to calm, not kill. The language shifts here. Where women spoke in detail about violent husbands or demanding elders, their accounts of children are sparse. This silence is not proof of innocence or guilt. It is evidence of the limits of what can be spoken. The court could not extract coherence where none existed. Midwives and infant deaths. Midwives appear again in these cases, but differently. They were present at births and early illnesses. They were sometimes accused of advising on how to end a child's life quietly. They were also accused of failing to intervene or of reframing deaths as natural. As with other allegations, these claims are difficult to test. What can be said is that the same structure that made poisoning adults possible, domestic privacy, informal medical authority, and routine illness, also made it possible to conceal the poisoning of infants. A baby's death did not require explanation beyond sorrow. The court's discomfort. Judges and prosecutors struggled with these cases. Child victims disrupted the narrative that allowed the poisonings to be framed as desperate responses to cruelty or endless care. They exposed something harsher, that once poison was accepted as a tool, it could be applied to those who had done nothing except exist in difficult circumstances. Sentences in cases involving children varied. Some women were convicted. Some charges were reduced. Some cases could not be proven at all due to decomposition or lack of records. The law demanded proof. Emotion demanded condemnation. The record sits uneasily between the two. Community reaction. Within the villages, these revelations were devastating. A community can rationalize the death of a violent man. It can even rationalize the death of a frail elder. The death of a child collapses those rationalizations. Women suspected of harming children were isolated more completely than others. Acquittal did not restore trust. Suspicion attached not only to the accused but to their families. The social sentence often outlasted the legal one. Breaking the explanatory frame. The presence of child victims forces a correction to any interpretation that relies too heavily on victim behavior. Not all victims were abusers. Not all victims imposed unbearable labor. Not all victims represented obstacles to survival. Some were simply vulnerable. This matters because it shows that the poisonings were not a coherent response to injustice. They were a practice that escaped its original justifications and expanded into something else. Once a method is normalized, its application widens. What these deaths reveal. The deaths of children reveal the most dangerous aspect of the case, how quickly moral boundaries can erode once killing is framed as solution rather than violation. The same domestic logic that allowed poison to be used quietly against adults, privacy, routine, and care, also enabled its use against children who could not speak, accuse, or resist. There is no way to narrate these deaths without discomfort. They stand as the point at which understanding must stop short of explanation. The last category before exposure. Children were not the last to die before the case broke open. But their deaths represent the furthest reach of the practice before it was interrupted. They mark the point at which the private logic of the household collided with something the wider world could not absorb, even after the fact. When the anonymous letters were written in June 1929, they named men, not children. Yet by the time the investigation expanded, the presence of child victims ensured that the story could no longer be contained within arguments about endurance, violence, or burden. Chapter 8, Zuzana Fazekas, the midwife at the center. Zuzana Fazekas did not set out to become the center of a national scandal. She became it because her role placed her at the intersection of women's lives, illness, secrecy, and authority in a region where few others occupied that space. When the poisonings were exposed, her name offered something the investigation needed, a figure who could be pointed to, explained, and blamed. What survives in the record about her is uneven. What has been built around her since is often excessive. To understand her place in this story, it is necessary to separate what can be established from what later imagination supplied. Early life and position in Nagyrév. Zuzana Ola was born on May 20, 1861. The details of her childhood are sparse. Like many rural women of her generation, she entered adulthood without leaving much documentary trace. Her later married name, Fazekas, is the name under which she appears in testimony and press accounts. By the early 20th century, she was the recognized midwife in Nagyrév. This position mattered more than any formal qualification. A midwife's authority came from repetition and success. She had attended births, managed crises, and been present at moments of pain and relief that bound women to her over decades. Her familiarity with bodies, blood, and failure gave her a kind of credibility that no distant doctor could easily replace. She was known locally as Auntie Zootsie, a title that conveyed age, familiarity, and trust rather than affection alone. Access without suspicion. Fazekas's daily work placed her inside households at moments when privacy was already suspended. She could arrive at night. She could stay for hours. She could enter kitchens, bedrooms, and sick rooms without explanation. Her presence did not raise alarm. It reassured. In a village where women's suffering was often managed quietly, a midwife represented both competence and discretion. She was expected to know things that were not spoken openly. She was also expected not to repeat what she knew. This made her an ideal conduit for information, accurate or not, once fear entered the region. What testimony says, and cannot prove. When the investigation began, multiple women named Fazekas in their statements. They described her as someone who advised, encouraged, or supplied poison. Some claimed she demonstrated how arsenic could be extracted from flypaper. Others claimed she reassured them that death would look like illness. Some said she spoke of poison as a solution to unbearable situations. These accounts overlap, but they are not identical. They emerge after arrests, after exhumations, and after the realization that poison could be detected in the dead. They are shaped by self-preservation as much as recollection. In such an environment, naming a central figure could function as explanation, mitigation, or deflection. This does not mean the statements are false. It means they must be read with caution. The problem of absence. Fazekas never stood trial. She died on July 19, 1929, shortly after the investigation began, reported as suicide by poison. Her death removed the most frequently named individual from questioning and confrontation. It also froze her role in place. A living defendant can contradict testimony. A dead one cannot. Her death allowed her name to absorb responsibility in a way that simplified the story for courts and public alike. It reduced the need to ask how many women acted without her involvement, or why the practice persisted beyond any single source. Absence creates certainty where complexity once existed. The convenience of a focal figure. For the villages, Fazekas's death offered grim relief. It allowed blame to be concentrated. It suggested an origin point. It provided a way to speak about the poisonings without accusing neighbors who still had to live side by side. For the courts, her absence removed a central ambiguity. They could proceed against others without fully untangling her role. The trials became about individual acts rather than the influence of an untestable figure. For the press, she was irresistible. A midwife who helped women give life and then helped them take it fit neatly into sensational framing. Her story could be told quickly and memorably, especially once she was no longer alive to complicate it. What the record actually supports. What can be said with confidence is limited, but significant. Fazekas had access to households. She had authority among women. She had knowledge of illness and care. She was named repeatedly in early testimony. What cannot be said with certainty is the extent of her direct involvement. There is no reliable evidence that she personally poisoned dozens of people. There is no proof that she supplied poison in every case. There is no way to know how much of what was attributed to her was retrospective consolidation rather than direct action. The record supports influence more than orchestration. Midwife as symbol rather than cause. The fixation on Fazeka's risks misunderstanding the case itself. If she is treated as the sole origin, the question of why the practice spread collapses into a personality story. This is comforting, but it is inaccurate. A practice that persisted across years and villages required conditions, not just instruction. Women acted because poison fit their circumstances, not because one woman told them to. Fazekas may have facilitated, advised, or supplied in some cases. She did not create the pressures that made poisoning imaginable, nor did her death end those pressures. The afterlife of her name. After her death, Fazekas became less a person than a placeholder. She stood in for all that was frightening about the case: female knowledge, secrecy, the inversion of care into harm. Over time, she became exaggerated into something closer to myth, a mastermind, a witch, a corrupter of women. This transformation says as much about public fear as it does about her actions. A story with one villain is easier to close than a story about many ordinary people making unbearable choices inside a broken system. Holding complexity without collapse. To write honestly about Zuzana Fazekas is to resist the urge to simplify her. She was not merely a monster. She was not merely a scapegoat. She was not merely a victim of accusation. She was a midwife in a region that placed enormous authority in the hands of women who managed pain without oversight. She lived inside the same pressures as the women who later named her. She died before she could explain herself. Her place in this story is central, but not total. Understanding that distinction matters, because the poisonings did not end with her death. They ended when the state intervened. That intervention did not occur because one woman existed, but because a pattern was finally forced into the open. Chapter 9: Other Midwives, Advisors, and the Spread of Knowledge. The focus on Zuzana Fazekas obscures an uncomfortable reality: the poisonings did not depend on one woman. They depended on circulation. Once the investigation expanded beyond Nagyrév, it became clear that knowledge had moved through the region along ordinary social paths. Advice did not require secrecy. It traveled the same way everything else did in village life, through work, childbirth, illness, kinship, and long hours spent together in kitchens and yards. Midwives were part of this circulation, but they were not the only channel. Balanced Sordas and Early Testimony. One of the earliest names to appear alongside Fazekas's was that of Balanced Sordas, another midwife active in the region. She was identified in initial confessions as someone who had knowledge of poison and who advised women in difficult situations. Like Fazekas, she moved between households and occupied a position that combined authority with discretion. Unlike Fazekas, she lived to be questioned. Testimony concerning Sordas was less uniform. Some women named her directly as a source of poison or instruction. Others mentioned her as someone who spoke openly about arsenic as a solution to suffering. Still others denied any involvement beyond general conversation. The accounts do not align neatly, and the record does not support the idea that she functioned as a regional organizer. What they do support is the existence of more than one point of access. This matters because it demonstrates that the practice did not hinge on a single personality. It rested on the availability of knowledge and the absence of intervention. Advisors who were not midwives. Not all women learned through midwives. Several defendants testified that they learned about poisoning from neighbors, relatives, or other women who had already acted. In these cases, advice did not come with authority in the formal sense. It came with familiarity. A woman might hear that another woman's violent husband had died quietly. She might hear that no one had been punished. She might hear that illness was the explanation. That was often enough. Knowledge does not always need instruction. Sometimes it needs only confirmation that something is possible. Conversations that could not be recorded. Village life produces long, unstructured conversations. Women worked together in fields. They washed clothes together. They prepared food together for weddings and funerals. They waited together through births and illness. These were spaces where frustration, fear, and resentment could be voiced without minutes being taken. No transcript exists for these conversations. What survives are fragments reported later, under pressure, in courtrooms where language is shaped by fear and hindsight. A woman might say, "She told me it could be done," or "They all spoke about it," without being able to reconstruct who said what when, or with what intent. This does not mean the conversations did not occur. It means that by the time they entered the record, they had already been reshaped by exposure. The absence of conspiracy. Investigators searched for organization. They found none. There was no evidence of meetings, planning, or coordinated action across villages. There was no central supply chain. There was no hierarchy of instruction. What existed was repetition without interruption. The same pressures appeared again and again. The same method reappeared. The same explanations were accepted. A practice does not require conspiracy if conditions keep reproducing it. How advice functions in desperate environments. Advice in such environments does not sound like incitement. It sounds like reassurance. A woman might be told that illness would come first. She might be told that death would not be violent. She might be told that no one would suspect. She might be told that others had done the same. This kind of reassurance does not need to be delivered by a villain. It can come from someone who believes she is helping. The line between comfort and encouragement blurs quickly when lawful solutions are absent. The role of credibility. What made certain advisors influential was not cruelty, but credibility. A midwife who had seen many deaths could speak about illness convincingly. A neighbor whose husband had died without consequence could serve as proof that the method worked. A woman who had endured similar abuse could offer validation that no outsider would provide. Credibility is contextual. It does not require education. It requires proximity. When knowledge becomes normal. The most dangerous moment in the spread of the poisonings was not the first act. It was the moment the act became thinkable without shock. Once a woman believed that poisoning was something other women do, the moral barrier lowered. Once it became part of the region's unspoken repertoire, it no longer required a dramatic trigger. It could be considered alongside other options, however grim. This is how practices persist without instruction manuals or leaders. Responsibility without reduction. Recognizing that knowledge spread through multiple channels does not dissolve responsibility. Each act still required a decision. Each death still involved a person choosing to administer poison. Each advisor, whether midwife or neighbor, still made choices about what to say and what to withhold. What it does challenge is the urge to compress responsibility into a single figure. The case does not become safer or easier when reduced to one woman's influence. It becomes less accurate. Why this matters for the trials. The courts were forced to work with individuals, not systems. They charged people where they could. They punished acts that could be proven. They could not prosecute a network that did not exist in legal terms. As a result, the legal record gives the impression of isolated crimes connected by a few prominent names. The lived reality was messier and more diffuse. Understanding that diffusion is essential to understanding why the poisonings lasted as long as they did. The point of no return. By the time the investigation began in earnest, knowledge had already spread far enough that stopping it required external force. Advice had circulated. Examples had accumulated. Fear had replaced silence. The practice did not end because women changed their minds. It ended because graves were opened and arsenic spoke. Chapter 10. The Women Who Poisoned Once. Not every woman involved in the Tsezug poisonings acted repeatedly. Some poisoned one person, one time, and never again. These cases are the hardest to interpret and the easiest to erase. They do not fit the image of serial offending, nor do they support the idea of a coordinated practice carried out over years by the same hands. They sit in an uneasy space between desperation and decision. A single act, not a pattern. In the court records, several defendants were linked to only one confirmed poisoning. Their names appear briefly. Their cases are often resolved quickly. Their lives before and after the act leave little trace beyond that moment. They were not figures who spoke often in testimony, and they were rarely central to the prosecution's narrative. This does not make their actions minor. It makes them isolated. A woman who poisoned once did not necessarily see herself as entering a practice. She may have believed she was ending a situation that had become intolerable. The absence of repetition suggests not restraint alone, but that the act itself carried a weight that did not invite return. Circumstances rather than opportunity. Unlike repeat cases, these poisonings were often tied to a specific crisis. A husband's violence escalated suddenly. A dispute over inheritance reached an impasse. An illness worsened beyond what the household could manage. A threat was made that felt final. In such moments, a woman might reach for the solution she had heard existed without imagining it as something she would ever need again. This distinction matters. The court tended to treat repeat offenders as evidence of calculation. Single-incident defendants were more difficult to categorize. Their motives appeared narrower. Their actions did not form a narrative arc. Testimony marked by restraint. Women accused of poisoning once often spoke minimally. Some admitted to the act without elaboration. Others acknowledged administering something but denied intent to kill. Some claimed they believed the substance would calm or relieve symptoms rather than end life. These claims were not always accepted, but they reveal how women framed their own actions. The language is careful. They rarely spoke of hatred. They rarely spoke of revenge. They spoke instead of endings. An end to violence. An end to illness. An end to fear. This language does not absolve the act. It shows how the act was understood by the person who committed it. The absence of bravado. What is striking in these cases is the absence of pride or justification. These women did not describe poisoning as clever or effective. They did not describe it as a tool to be reused. In several cases, the act appears to have been followed by withdrawal rather than empowerment. Some women became more isolated after the death. Some did not remarry. Some lived quietly and avoided attention. Their behavior does not suggest triumph. It suggests survival without satisfaction. Legal treatment of single-incident cases. The courts approached these cases unevenly. Where arsenic was confirmed and confession was clear, conviction followed. Where evidence was weaker, charges were reduced or dismissed. Sentences varied widely, reflecting both the limits of proof and the discomfort of categorizing a one-time act. A woman who poisoned once could receive a lighter sentence than a repeat offender, but she could also be punished harshly if the court interpreted her act as premeditated rather than reactive. The law demanded clarity. The cases provided none. Community memory and quiet erasure. Within villages, these women often disappeared from public discussion. They were not remembered as archetypes. They were not named in press accounts. Their stories were overshadowed by those of repeat offenders and by the figure of the midwife. In some cases, neighbors chose to forget. Forgetting was not forgiveness. It was a way of restoring a fragile normality. A village cannot live indefinitely in confrontation with its own capacity for violence. It survives by selecting what it will remember. Single-incident poisoners were easier to forget because they did not challenge daily life repeatedly. Their act was absorbed and then sealed away. The moral ambiguity that remains. These cases resist moral clarity more than any other. They cannot be explained away as long-term strategy. They cannot be framed as habit. They cannot be dismissed as ignorance. Each represents a moment where a woman crossed a line she had not crossed before and did not cross again. Understanding that moment requires acknowledging both pressure and agency. The presence of such cases undermines any attempt to portray the poisonings as either mass hysteria or organized crime. They were neither. They were decisions made under constraint, repeated by some, rejected by others, and tolerated by a system that intervened too late. Why these women matter? The women who poisoned once matter because they reveal how close the boundary was. The difference between a woman who never poisoned and a woman who poisoned once may not have been character or morality. It may have been circumstance, timing, or access to reassurance at a critical moment. This is uncomfortable to admit. It suggests that the line between endurance and action was thinner than anyone would like to believe. The transition to repetition. Not all women stopped after one act. Some poisoned again. Their cases look different. Their testimony shifts. Their relationship to the method changes. The act becomes less singular and more integrated into how they manage conflict and burden. It is to those women that the record pays the most attention, and it is their stories that most clearly demonstrate how a private solution can become routine. Chapter 11. The Women Who Poisoned More Than Once. When poisoning occurred more than once in the same household, the case changed character. Repetition altered how the courts interpreted intent and how the public understood the crime. A single act could be framed as desperation. Multiple acts suggested something colder, more deliberate, and harder to reconcile with narratives of endurance alone. These cases drew the most attention during the investigation, not only because of the number of deaths involved, but because repetition disrupted the belief that poison had been used only as a last resort. Repetition as escalation. In households where more than one person died, poisoning did not happen in a vacuum. The first death created knowledge. The second confirmed it. Once a woman had poisoned someone and faced no immediate consequence, the act moved from unimaginable to possible, and from possible to usable. The absence of intervention mattered as much as the initial decision. Each unchallenged death reinforced the belief that illness provided adequate cover. In these households, poison became part of the domestic landscape. Patterns in repeat cases. Repeat poisonings often followed recognizable patterns. The victims were related by proximity rather than time. A husband might die, followed months or years later by a father-in-law. An elderly relative might die, followed by a dependent sibling or child. The deaths were not rushed. They were spaced. They fit into household rhythms. Each could be explained independently as illness. Together, they revealed something else. This spacing is important. It suggests that these women were not acting in frenzy. They were acting when pressure returned and no alternative appeared. Shifts in language and demeanor. Testimony from women accused of multiple poisonings differs subtly from that of single-incident defendants. Their language is more practical. Their descriptions are less emotional. Their explanations focus on necessity rather than crisis. Some spoke of poisoning as something that had to be done, rather than something that happened. Others described the act in terms that suggested familiarity rather than fear. This shift does not indicate ease, but it does indicate adaptation. Repetition changes how an act is carried internally. Calculation without drama. The record does not show theatrical cruelty. There are no descriptions of taunting, spectacle, or overt sadism. Poison was administered quietly, often in food or drink prepared as part of routine care. The method remained the same because it continued to work. What appears instead is calculation shaped by domestic constraint. How much could be given without immediate collapse? How illness could be extended to appear natural? When death would cause the least disruption? These calculations are chilling precisely because they are ordinary. Households as closed systems. Repeat poisonings reveal the household as a closed system. Information circulated inside it. Responsibility was contained within it. Outcomes were absorbed by it. Neighbors might suspect, but suspicion did not break the system open. Authority did not enter. Each death reset the household's balance without outside scrutiny. This closure is what allowed repetition. The limits of sympathy. These cases are where sympathy often collapses. It is difficult to frame repeated killing as an act of desperation alone. The second and third deaths cannot be explained entirely by crisis. They suggest acceptance of the method as solution. This does not require the women involved to have been unfeeling. It requires only that the moral boundary had shifted. Once killing is no longer unthinkable, the threshold for repetition lowers. Children and repetition. In some repeat cases, children were among the victims. This intensified public condemnation and influenced sentencing. The courts treated these cases as evidence that poison had escaped any initial justification. The presence of children confirmed that the practice was not confined to removing aggressors or burdens, but had become a tool applied broadly. These cases were among the most harshly judged. How the courts responded. Repeat offenders were more likely to receive severe sentences. Where evidence supported multiple deaths, courts interpreted the acts as premeditated and sustained. Confessions carried less mitigating weight. Claims of desperation were less persuasive. The law demanded a boundary, and repetition crossed it. Even so, not all repeat cases resulted in conviction for every suspected death. Proof still depended on exhumation results and testimony. Some deaths remained unproven, even when strongly suspected. Justice remained uneven. Community reaction. Within villages, repeat offenders were feared. They were not merely pitted or whispered about. They were avoided. Their presence unsettled the fragile normality that communities attempted to rebuild after exposure. In some cases, families distanced themselves from accused women long before verdicts were delivered. Fear replaced silence. What repetition reveals. Repeat poisonings expose the central danger of the Nagyrév case. A method that fits domestic life can be reused without immediate consequence. When it is, killing becomes integrated into routine rather than remaining an exception. This does not happen because people lose all sense of right and wrong. It happens because the system offers no alternative and no interruption. Repetition is not the beginning of evil. It is the moment when evil becomes manageable. The turning point toward exposure. Ironically, repetition also made exposure more likely. The more deaths accumulated in the same households and villages, the harder it became to explain them all away as coincidence. Patterns sharpened. Unease grew. Someone eventually chose to write what others had only thought. The women who poisoned more than once did not cause the investigation alone, but their actions contributed to the density of suspicion that finally forced it into the open. Chapter 12. The Letters of June 1929. The silence did not break all at once. It broke because someone decided that quiet knowledge was no longer survivable. On June 15, 1929, 2 anonymous letters reached the gendarmes in Tissékert. The letters were brief, direct, and specific. They did not speculate. They accused. They named households and named deaths that had already been accepted as natural. They claimed that men had been poisoned by women in their own families and that this had happened more than once. Anonymous letters were not unusual. What made these different was detail. They referred to particular relationships rather than general rumors. They identified men who had died years earlier. They pointed to patterns that could be checked rather than grievances that could be dismissed. The letters did not read like personal vendettas. They read like someone who expected to be believed. Why then? The timing of the letters matters. By 1929, unease in the region had grown harder to contain. Too many similar deaths had occurred across neighboring villages. Too many women had spoken privately about poison, about methods, about illness that looked familiar. The practice had expanded far enough that silence no longer felt protective. Exposure carries risk. Writing to authorities in a small district where everyone knows one another is not a neutral act. An anonymous letter is often the last resort of someone who believes that speaking openly would be dangerous. The letters suggest urgency rather than outrage. They do not demand punishment. They demand attention. The decision to act. At first, the gendarmes treated the letters cautiously. Rural authorities were accustomed to anonymous accusations motivated by inheritance disputes, jealousy, or long-standing feuds. Acting on such letters without corroboration risked destabilizing villages and provoking backlash. But the specificity of the accusations made dismissal difficult. The letters described deaths that could be verified. They named households where more than one man had died. They implied a method that, if true, could be tested. An investigation was opened. This decision marked the end of private containment. Questioning begins. The first questioning focused on the households named in the letters. What surprised investigators was not resistance, but partial confirmation. Some of the women questioned did not deny everything. They spoke cautiously. They admitted to administering substances. They described illness and decline. They named others. The investigation did not widen because of zeal. It widened because of overlap. The same names appeared in multiple statements. The same method was described. The same explanation, illness, was repeated. Within days, the case outgrew the letters that had begun it. The naming of the midwives. As questioning continued, attention turned quickly toward midwives. Women spoke of advice given. They spoke of reassurance. They spoke of learning how poison could be obtained and used without attracting suspicion. 2 names appeared early and repeatedly, Zuzana Fazekas of Nagyrév and Balint Sordas. These names mattered because they offered structure. Midwives moved between households. They were trusted. They could explain illness. They could normalize outcomes. Whether they acted as suppliers, advisors, or symbols, their presence in testimony gave investigators something to follow. The investigation began to move outward from households to the network of knowledge that connected them. Fear enters the villages. Once questioning began, fear spread quickly. People understood what exhumation meant. A grave opened years later could still speak. A death that had been accepted quietly could be reclassified as murder. Silence no longer guaranteed safety. This fear reshaped testimony. Some people spoke to protect themselves. Some spoke to redirect suspicion. Some spoke because they believed speaking first was safer than being named later. The record reflects this pressure. Statements are uneven. Details shift. Motives blur. The truth does not emerge cleanly. It accumulates. Arrests and the loss of control. On June 29, 1929, the district court ordered the arrest of several individuals named in the early stages of the investigation. Arrests are public acts in villages. Uniforms appeared at gates. Women were taken away in daylight. News traveled ahead of officials. By the time one arrest was made, the next household already knew why. With the arrests, the case ceased to belong to the villages. It belonged to the state. From suspicion to proof. Accusation alone was not enough to sustain prosecutions. The authorities needed proof that could withstand court scrutiny. Confessions could be retracted. Testimony could be challenged. Illness could still be claimed. This left only one option. The dead would have to be examined. Orders for exhumation followed. Graves that had been left undisturbed for years were opened. Coffins were raised. Remains were examined for arsenic, a substance known to persist long after burial. What the exhumations revealed would transform suspicion into evidence and force the investigation into a new phase. The letters of June 1929 had done their work. They had made silence impossible. What followed would ensure that the story could never return to the household alone. Chapter 13: Exhumation and Proof. Once the investigation moved beyond rumor and confession, it ran into a familiar wall. People can lie. People can misremember. People can accuse to protect themselves. Courts know this. Investigators know this. A case built only on village talk was vulnerable to collapse the moment a defendant recanted or a witness contradicted herself. So the state did what it rarely did in rural districts. It turned to the dead. Graves as evidence. Exhumation is an act of authority. It announces that the household no longer controls its own story, and that death itself can be reclassified. In the Tsezug, this was a rupture. Many of the bodies in question had been buried years earlier with no suspicion attached. Their families had already mourned. Their deaths had already been explained. Now those explanations were being challenged. The decision to exhume was not taken lightly, but it was unavoidable. If poisoning had occurred, investigators needed a substance that could still be detected after burial. Arsenic was one of the few poisons that offered that possibility. It persists. It binds. It lingers in tissue and bone long after other evidence is gone. That persistence made it central to the case. The practical mechanics of reopening the past. Exhumations were guided by accusation. Authorities did not open every grave in the region. They targeted bodies connected to confessions, to the anonymous letters, and to repeated patterns in particular households. This means the exhumation record reflects the shape of suspicion, not the full shape of death. A grave was selected. A coffin was raised. Remains were examined. Samples were taken. Chemical testing was performed. Each step came with limitations. Bodies buried for years were altered by soil, water, temperature, and coffin materials. The condition of remains varied widely. Some yielded clearer results than others. In some cases, decomposition or environmental factors complicated interpretation. The forensic process offered power, but not perfection. When arsenic was found. Where arsenic was detected in lethal quantities, suspicion hardened into evidence. A death that had been mourned as illness became homicide in an instant. A widow who had lived quietly for years became a defendant. A family history became a crime scene. This is the moment the case became irreversible. Confessions could be disputed. Arsenic could not. The discovery of arsenic in multiple bodies confirmed what the letters had alleged, that the region had experienced not one poisoning, but many. It also clarified something else, that the poisonings had been effective not because they were secret, but because they resembled the illnesses already common in village life. When arsenic was not found, negative or inconclusive results did not necessarily mean innocence. Arsenic detection depends on many factors: the condition of the body, the time since burial, soil chemistry, and the integrity of samples. Some deaths suspected by villagers could not be confirmed chemically. Some graves may never have been opened at all. The court was forced into an uncomfortable position. It could punish only what could be proven. It could not prosecute on suspicion alone. This created a split record, confirmed victims on one side, suspected victims on the other, and a wide gray space between them. That gray space would never close completely. The numbers and their distortion. As the case traveled beyond the Tisezug, numbers began to inflate. Sensational retellings later spoke in totals that suggested certainty where none existed. The forensic record, by contrast, is bounded by what was actually tested and confirmed. Dozens of bodies were exhumed and examined, multiple were confirmed to contain lethal arsenic. The exact number of victims across the entire period remains disputed and cannot be fixed with precision. This matters because numbers shape interpretation. A precise number suggests a complete record. This case does not have one. It has confirmed deaths, suspected deaths, and deaths that were never reopened. A truthful account holds those distinctions without trying to force them into a single total. The effect on the villages. Exhumation did not just produce evidence. It produced fear. Once the state began opening graves, every family with a history of sudden illness had reason to worry. Women who had once believed the household would keep its secrets realized that the body itself could speak years later. People began to adjust their stories. Some who had been silent began to talk. Some who had confessed began to minimize. Some who had accused others became cautious. Fear reorganizes truth. It does not create it, but it changes what people are willing to admit. The exhumations intensified that pressure. The collapse of plausible deniability. Before the exhumations, many people could tell themselves that rumors were rumors. After arsenic was found, plausible deniability ended. The region could no longer treat the poisonings as isolated tragedies or malicious gossip. It was forced to accept that what had been suspected privately had been real enough to leave chemical traces in the dead. This is where the case's scale becomes visible, not necessarily in a final number, but in the breadth of confirmed murder across households and years. The dead as the most reliable witnesses. In domestic crime, the living are often unreliable witnesses. They are loyal. They are afraid. They are implicated. They want the story to stop. The dead, by contrast, cannot protect anyone's reputation. They cannot adjust their memories. They cannot bargain. They can only bear trace. Arsenic served as a kind of testimony the court could accept without needing to know the whole household story. It did not explain motive. It did not name a hand. But it confirmed the central claim: these deaths were not natural. Proof without completion. Even with exhumations, the investigation could not become complete. Some bodies were never exhumed. Some exhumations were inconclusive. Some confessions referred to deaths that could not be tested. Some women were accused without sufficient evidence to charge. The forensic record strengthened the case, but it also set the boundary of what could be pursued. From this point on, the story becomes less about discovery and more about prosecution. The state had proof. Now it had to decide what to do with it, who to arrest, who to charge, whose testimony to trust, and which deaths to bring into court as murders rather than suspicions. The next phase would be shaped not by village life, but by the machinery of law. Chapter 14: Arrests and Confessions. Once arsenic was found in the dead, the investigation hardened. What had begun as questioning became custody. What had been tentative became urgent. The state no longer needed to persuade itself that something criminal had occurred. It needed to determine who could be held responsible in a form the courts would accept. Arrest was the first irreversible step. Arrest as public rupture. On June 29, 1929, the district court authorized the arrest of several individuals named in early testimony. In villages, arrest is not discreet. There are no corridors or waiting rooms. There are gates, yards, neighbors watching from doorways, children sent inside, voices lowered too late. A woman taken from her home in daylight is already marked before she reaches a cell. These arrests traveled faster than any official notice. By the time gendarmes arrived at one house, the next household already understood what was coming. Fear spread outward from each arrest, tightening the atmosphere in which every subsequent statement would be given. Custody changes speech. Confession does not occur in a vacuum. Once women were taken into custody, the stakes changed. Silence no longer felt safe. Denial risked contradiction by forensic proof. Admitting too much risked severe punishment. The space for a neutral account disappeared. Statements given at this stage reflect that pressure. Some women admitted to poisoning outright. Some admitted to administering a substance but denied intent to kill. Some acknowledged knowledge without action. Some named others before being named themselves. Confession became both disclosure and defense. The logic behind naming others. Naming another person served several purposes. It demonstrated cooperation. It shifted attention away from sole responsibility. It provided an explanation for how knowledge had been acquired. Midwives were named frequently, but so were neighbors, relatives, and other women who had already acted. In some cases, a woman named someone who had died, knowing that contradiction was impossible. In others, she named someone still living, creating a chain reaction of questioning. This process did not necessarily reflect truth in a simple way. It reflected fear, overlap, and contradiction. As statements accumulated, patterns emerged, but so did contradictions. Dates did not always align. Methods were described differently. The same conversation was attributed to different speakers. Investigators were aware of these inconsistencies, but they were also aware that perfect alignment was unrealistic. The acts in question had occurred years earlier, under stress, without documentation, inside households where memory was shaped by emotion and survival. The task was not to produce a single coherent narrative. It was to identify where enough overlap existed to support prosecution. Confessions and the role of arsenic. The presence of forensic proof altered how confessions were treated. Where arsenic had been confirmed in a body, a confession carried greater weight. Where no arsenic was found, confessions were scrutinized more cautiously. In some cases, charges were dropped despite admission because the physical evidence could not support them. This created frustration on all sides. Women who confessed sometimes expected leniency that did not come. Others denied acts that the dead appeared to confirm. The law does not reward honesty consistently when proof is uneven. The emotional register of confession. What is striking in many confessions is their tone. There is little theatrical remorse. There is little defiance. Most statements are flat, factual, constrained. Women described what they did with the same language they used to describe daily work. The act of poisoning was narrated as something done, not as something dwelled upon. This does not indicate lack of feeling. It indicates compartmentalization. When survival requires emotional restraint, even confession can sound procedural. The disappearance of privacy. Custody stripped away the last protection the household offered. Acts that had taken place in kitchens and sick rooms were now discussed in offices and cells. Domestic life was translated into legal language. Care became evidence. Routine became suspicion. This translation was not neutral. Actions that had once been invisible became legible in ways that were often hostile to context. The law asked what was done. It did not ask how long a woman had endured before acting. Women who did not confess. Not all women confessed. Some denied everything, even when arsenic was found. Some maintained innocence until sentencing. Some refused to name others despite pressure. These refusals complicated the prosecution and created divisions between defendants. Silence was risky. A woman who refused to speak could be framed as uncooperative. But speaking carried its own risks, especially when testimony implicated neighbors who would one day return to the same villages. There was no safe strategy. The narrowing of the case. As arrests continued, the investigation narrowed. The state could not prosecute everyone suspected. It had to choose cases where evidence aligned strongly enough to withstand trial. Some names dropped out of the process. Some deaths were left unexplored. Some women returned home under suspicion without charge. This selectivity was not mercy. It was necessity. The law moved forward with what it could carry. From confession to courtroom. By the time the first trials were scheduled, the shape of the case had been set. Arrests had defined the defendants. Confessions had shaped the narrative. Exhumations had set the limits of proof. What remained was to present these fragments in court and ask judges to render decisions that would stand beyond the villages where the acts had occurred. The confessions did not end uncertainty. They formalized it. Chapter 15, Trials and Testimony. When the cases reached court, the story changed shape again. What had been lived as domestic life and investigated as pattern now had to be presented as discrete acts that fit the language of criminal law. Kitchens became crime scenes. Care became method. Memory became testimony. The court required clarity from lives that had never been organized that way. This translation was imperfect from the start. The courtroom as an alien space. For most defendants, the courtroom was unfamiliar territory. They were rural women with limited education, accustomed to authority exercised through family, church, and custom rather than formal procedure. The language of law was distant from the language of daily life. Questions were precise where memory was not. Timelines were demanded where events had blended together over years. The court expected sequence. Village life had offered repetition. This mismatch shaped everything that followed. Building cases from fragments. Prosecutors did not present a single, unified narrative. They presented cases one by one, each built from a combination of confession, forensic finding, and witness testimony. Some cases were strong, anchored by arsenic detected in the body and an admission that aligned with it. Others were fragile, dependent on recollection alone. Judges were required to assess credibility in an environment saturated with fear. A woman who contradicted herself might be lying. She might also be remembering under pressure. The court could not easily distinguish between the two. Witnesses from within the household. Much of the testimony came from people who had lived inside the same houses as the accused. Relatives described illness, arguments, and care routines. Neighbors described what they had seen or heard through walls and over fences. These accounts were partial by nature. No one had observed the act itself in most cases. What witnesses could offer were impressions. That a man had complained his food tasted strange. That a woman had behaved calmly after a death. That illness followed conflict. Such impressions gained weight only when combined with forensic proof. The problem of hindsight. The trials were haunted by hindsight. Once arsenic had been found, earlier memories rearranged themselves. Symptoms that had once seemed ordinary became suspicious. Words spoken by dying men were reinterpreted as warnings. A widow's behavior was read backwards through the lens of guilt. The court attempted to guard against this, but it could not erase it. Human memory does not remain fixed when new meaning is imposed. Confessions under scrutiny. Confessions were examined carefully, but they did not function as decisive proof on their own. Some defendants retracted earlier statements, claiming fear or misunderstanding. Others stood by their admissions but minimized intent. Judges were required to decide which parts of a confession could be trusted and which were shaped by pressure. In cases where arsenic had been confirmed, confessions were easier to accept. Where forensic evidence was absent or inconclusive, confessions alone were sometimes deemed insufficient for conviction. This distinction produced uneven outcomes that reflected evidence rather than moral certainty. The absence of the central figure. Zuzana Fazekas was never present in the courtroom. Her name appeared repeatedly in testimony, but she could not be questioned. Statements about her role could not be tested against her own account. Judges were forced to decide how much weight to give to references that could neither be confirmed nor denied. Her absence created a vacuum. It allowed her to function as explanation without examination, and it allowed others to frame their own actions in relation to a figure who could no longer complicate the narrative. Gender and expectation in judgment. The fact that the defendants were women shaped the proceedings in subtle ways. Prosecutors emphasized betrayal of expected roles: wives as caregivers, mothers as protectors, midwives as guardians of life. This framing heightened the sense of transgression but did not necessarily clarify motive or method. At the same time, some judges appeared cautious, aware that the crimes had occurred in environments where women's agency was constrained. This tension, between condemnation and contextual awareness, runs through the verdicts. The court punished acts. It struggled to account for conditions. Children in the courtroom. Cases involving child victims altered the tone of proceedings. Judicial patience narrowed. Sympathy evaporated. Arguments rooted in exhaustion or fear carried less weight. The presence of children disrupted any attempt to frame poisoning as a response to unbearable authority. These cases often resulted in harsher judgments, not only because of the victim's vulnerability, but because they threatened the moral boundary the court needed to maintain. Translation without resolution. By the end of the trials, the court had established that poisoning had occurred and that specific defendants were responsible for specific deaths. What it had not established was a complete account. The trials did not explain how many deaths had gone unexamined. They did not account for every accusation. They did not resolve contradictions between testimony and memory. The law produced verdicts, not closure. The cost of legal clarity. Legal clarity requires simplification. A charge must be precise. A verdict must be definite. A sentence must be imposed. This necessity meant that much of what made the case possible, endurance, silence, fear, routine, fell outside the courtroom's reach. What remained was a set of judgments that could stand on paper, even if they left questions unanswered. Chapter 16: Verdicts, Sentences, and Executions. When the trials concluded, the legal record closed unevenly. There was no single verdict, no collective judgment that resolved the case as a whole. Instead, there were individual decisions, delivered across different courts, shaped by the strength or weakness of evidence in each file. What emerged was not a comprehensive reckoning, but a patchwork of punishment. This outcome was not accidental. It reflected the limits of what the law could carry after years of delay. Uneven justice by design. The courts did not sentence a phenomenon. They sentenced people. Each defendant stood before the court alone, charged with specific acts tied to specific bodies. The wider pattern, multiple villages, repeated deaths, shared methods, remained background context rather than a chargeable offense. This meant that two women whose actions appeared similar in village memory could receive radically different outcomes. A confirmed arsenic finding meant conviction. An inconclusive test meant doubt. A confession could strengthen a case or collapse under scrutiny. Justice followed proof, not experience. Prison sentences. Many convicted women received lengthy prison terms. These sentences varied depending on the number of deaths attributed to the defendant, the presence of confession, and the court's interpretation of intent. Some women were sentenced to years of hard labor. Others received shorter terms or were released after time served. Prison removed these women from village life, but it did not erase suspicion for those who returned. A sentence completed did not restore reputation. It simply marked a legal endpoint. Death sentences. A small number of defendants were sentenced to death. These sentences were reserved for cases involving multiple confirmed poisonings, particularly where children were among the victims. The courts treated repetition as evidence of premeditation and moral collapse. In these cases, arguments about desperation or endurance carried little weight. Not all death sentences resulted in execution. Some were commuted. Some were overturned. Some were carried out. The exact number of executions has been reported differently in later accounts, reflecting confusion between sentencing and implementation. What can be said with certainty is that executions occurred, and that they became the symbolic endpoint of the case in public memory. Execution as spectacle and closure. Executions served a purpose beyond punishment. They signaled that the state had reasserted control. They reassured the public that an extraordinary violation of social order had been met with extraordinary response. They allowed the case to be declared finished. For the villages, execution was distant. It happened elsewhere, away from the homes where the acts had occurred. It did not return the dead. It did not repair relationships. It did not address the years before intervention. It ended the legal story, not the social one. The absence of proportionality. One of the most enduring discomforts of the case lies in proportionality. Some women who poisoned were executed. Some who poisoned multiple times were imprisoned. Some who poisoned once were acquitted. Some suspected of poisoning were never charged at all. This disparity was not evidence of injustice in a simple sense. It was evidence of evidentiary survival. The law punished what could be proven and left the rest unresolved. This unevenness shaped how the case would be remembered. The role of gender in punishment. The fact that the defendants were women sharpened the response. Female violence, particularly violence enacted through care, violated deep expectations. Poisoning carried associations of deceit and cowardice that intensified condemnation. When children were involved, outrage hardened further. At the same time, some judges appeared reluctant to impose the harshest penalties in cases where violence, coercion, or extreme dependency was evident. This ambivalence appears in sentencing patterns that resist neat explanation. The courts oscillated between moral condemnation and contextual restraint. Finality without understanding. When the last sentence was handed down, the state moved on. There was no inquiry into systemic failure. There was no reform of rural medical oversight. There was no public reckoning with domestic violence or care labor. The machinery of justice had done what it was designed to do: isolate acts, assign blame, impose punishment, and close files. Understanding remained incomplete. What the sentences did not settle. The verdicts answered narrow questions. Did this defendant poison this person? Can it be proven? What punishment applies? They did not answer broader ones. How many deaths went undetected? Why were early warnings ignored? Why were women left without lawful exit from violent or consuming households? These questions lay outside the courtroom. The legal end of the case. With the final executions and imprisonments, the legal phase of the Nagyrév poisonings ended. The villages were left to absorb the aftermath. Families lived with knowledge that could not always be spoken. Suspicion lingered where verdicts had not resolved doubt. Reputation became a second sentence, served without end. The state had acted. The story, however, was not finished. Chapter 17, The Villages After Exposure. When the courts finished with the case, the villages were still there. Nagyrév, Tisakert, and the surrounding settlements did not dissolve into history because newspapers stopped coming. They remained what they had always been: places where people needed work, water, food, marriages, help at birth, help at death. The river kept moving. Fields still had to be planted. Children still had to be fed. But the villages did not return to what they had been before 1929. Exposure altered ordinary life in ways that did not require constant discussion to be real. Life continues, but trust changes. Village survival depends on trust. You accept food from a neighbor. You leave a child in someone's care for an hour. You drink what is offered. You allow another woman to sit at your bedside when you are sick. You let a midwife into your home with the private knowledge of your body. After the poisonings were revealed, those acts did not stop. They became cautious. People still visited the sick, but visits were shorter, more supervised. Women were more careful about what they accepted. A cup of tea was not refused openly, but it might be set down untouched. Help offered by the wrong person was declined with politeness. Suspicion turned ordinary gestures into tests. Trust does not disappear in a village. It rearranges. It becomes selective. It becomes political. Reputation as a second sentence. For those convicted and later released, punishment did not end at the prison gate. Even a woman who had served her sentence returned to a village where her name carried a story she could not rewrite. Acquittal did not guarantee safety. A woman could be cleared in court and still be avoided in life. Reputation functioned as a second sentence, imposed informally and served indefinitely. Families carried it too. Children of accused women grew up under a shadow. Sons struggled to marry. Daughters struggled to be trusted. A surname could become a warning even when the person carrying it had done nothing at all. In small communities, stigma attaches broadly because survival is relational. The damage inside households. The most enduring harm was not public. It was domestic. Some households had lost men who had been violent, controlling, or cruel. Their deaths might have ended abuse, but they also removed income, labor, and structure. A widow could find herself free from fear and still trapped by poverty. Remarriage might be necessary for survival, not romance. Other households lost men who had not been cruel, elderly relatives, dependents, children. In these families, exposure did not bring relief. It brought shame and grief that could not be spoken cleanly. And then there were households where accusation tore families apart even when conviction did not follow. Suspicion within a family can be more corrosive than a verdict. A brother might believe his mother killed his father. A daughter might suspect her aunt. A wife might fear she would be blamed for a death that was natural. The case created suspicion that could not always be resolved with proof. Women's networks under strain. Before 1929, women's networks were the infrastructure of village life. They provided care, information, labor sharing, and support. They were the ones who managed illness and childbirth and mourning. They were also the ones through whom knowledge about poisoning is said to have traveled. After exposure, These networks tightened. Women became more guarded in conversation. Advice was given less openly. Visits became more formal. Women who had once been helpers were watched, and women who had once relied on help feared what reliance might imply. The result was not only mistrust. It was isolation. Isolation is dangerous in rural life because it removes the very support that makes endurance possible. Midwives living under suspicion. Midwives who continued to work after the scandal did so under a changed gaze. The midwife's authority had always relied on trust. After Nagyrév, trust carried a second meaning, fear. Even when women still needed midwives, they watched them differently. A midwife's suggestions could be interpreted as advice toward harm. A midwife's presence at a death could be treated as incriminating. This suspicion did not make women safer. It made care lonelier. The scandal damaged the credibility of the role that had filled the gap left by absent doctors and distant institutions. The return of silence. After sensational attention faded, silence returned. Not because people forgot, but because constant open speech is not sustainable in villages where life must go on alongside those you suspect or those who suspect you. People learned when not to speak. They learned which families could not be discussed. They learned which deaths should not be reinterpreted aloud. They learned which names carried danger. Silence became a social tool again, but altered by what it now contained. The long consequence, fear of intervention. One of the less visible outcomes of the case was fear of the state. The villages had been invaded in a sense, not by soldiers, but by gendarmes, prosecutors, doctors, journalists and courts. Graves were opened. Women were taken away. Families were publicly named. Outsiders told the villages what they were. After such exposure, some people became more reluctant to draw attention to private harm, not less. A household might avoid reporting violence for fear that authorities would arrive with disruption rather than protection. A family might avoid calling a doctor for fear of scrutiny. A woman might endure longer because she had seen how the state entered domestic life only after catastrophe, and how blunt that entry could be. Intervention had not arrived early as help. It had arrived late as punishment. That distinction shaped behaviour. A community managing its own history. Over time, the villages developed ways to manage the story. Some families insisted on innocence regardless of evidence. Some maintained private knowledge without speaking publicly. Some avoided the subject entirely. Some turned the case into a warning story for children. Memory became another form of survival. Villages do not archive their past the way courts do. They carry it in what they avoid, what they repeat, and what they refuse to name. The aftermath as a living condition. The poisonings ended. The aftermath did not. It lived in altered relationships, in tightened networks, in cautious hospitality, in reputations that outlasted sentences. It lived in the knowledge that ordinary domestic acts, feeding, nursing, comforting, had once been used as cover for death. That knowledge is not dramatic. It is corrosive. And it ensured that, long after the last verdict, the case continued to shape daily life in ways that never appeared in any official file. Chapter 18. The Birth of the Angel Maker's Legend. The story did not stay in the villages. Once the trials were underway, it moved outward, first to regional newspapers, then to Budapest, and eventually beyond Hungary altogether. In the process, it changed form. What had been lived as years of quiet death and late intervention became something sharper, stranger, and easier to carry. It became a legend. From case to curiosity. For the press, the Nagyrév poisonings offered a rare combination. There were many victims. There were women as perpetrators. There was poison administered in the home. There was a midwife at the center. These elements could be arranged into a story that did not require familiarity with rural life or Hungarian social structure. They could be framed as anomaly rather than outcome. Early reporting focused on numbers and novelty. Headlines emphasized scale and shock. The idea that dozens of women might have poisoned dozens of men over years unsettled assumptions about gender and violence. The fact that the acts occurred inside families made them feel more transgressive still. The villages were no longer places. They were evidence. The power of a name. The phrase angel makers did not come from the women themselves. It emerged from outside, shaped by journalistic instinct and cultural expectation. The name carried irony and accusation at once, women who were meant to give life instead bringing death, women who made angels by killing. It was memorable. It was condemnatory. It was simple. And it flattened everything beneath it. A label does not need to be accurate to be effective. It needs only to travel. Gender panic and moral reversal. The angel maker's framing drew power from reversal. Women were expected to nurture. Midwives were expected to protect life. Mothers were expected to sacrifice. The case inverted those expectations, and inversion attracts attention. Much of the reporting lingered on this reversal rather than on the conditions that preceded it. Violence suffered by women was mentioned only insofar as it explained their cruelty. Poverty appeared as backdrop rather than force. Care labor appeared only as a setting, not as pressure. The story became about what women had done wrong, not about what they had been left to manage alone. The midwife as myth. Zuzana Fazekas's name took on new proportions once it entered the press. Her role, already enlarged by her absence at trial, expanded further. She was portrayed as instigator, corrupter, mastermind. In some accounts, she appeared almost supernatural, a woman who moved through villages teaching death. This image required little evidence. It required only a figure who could absorb blame and satisfy the demand for origin. A midwife was ideal. She carried authority. She moved between households. She dealt with life and death. Once dead herself, she could no longer complicate the story. The myth did not ask how many women acted without her. It did not ask why her death did not end the poisonings immediately. It asked only for a villain. Numbers without footing. As the story traveled, numbers grew. Confirmed deaths blurred into suspected deaths. Suspected deaths blurred into estimates. Estimates hardened into claims. Each retelling added scale without adding certainty. This inflation served a purpose. A higher number made the story more extraordinary. It reinforced the idea of aberration rather than accumulation. It suggested that something monstrous had taken hold in one corner of the country, rather than that familiar pressures had gone unaddressed for years. The result was a case remembered for magnitude rather than for delay. What the legend omitted. The legend did not include early warnings ignored by authorities. It did not include the doctor whose request for exhumation was refused. It did not include the confession that was treated as isolated. It did not include the absence of rural medical care. It did not include the lack of lawful exit from violent or consuming households. These details did not fit a story about deviant women. They pointed instead to institutional failure. Why simplification mattered. The simplified story performed a kind of social work. It reassured readers that the danger was exceptional rather than structural. It suggested that once a few women were punished, order was restored. It allowed the state to present the case as resolved rather than as diagnostic. A complex story asks for change. A simple one asks only for condemnation. The distance between legend and life. For the people of Nagyrév and the surrounding villages, the legend bore little resemblance to what they had lived. They did not recognize themselves as a nest of monsters. They recognized years of hardship, fear, resentment, endurance, and silence. They recognized neighbors, not archetypes. The legend traveled without them. It did not carry the cautious hospitality, the strained marriages, the altered women's networks, the children growing up under suspicion. It did not carry the aftermath. It carried a name. The cost of being remembered this way. Once a place becomes a legend, it loses control over its own memory. Nagyrév was no longer allowed to be ordinary. It was fixed as an example, a warning, a curiosity. This affected how outsiders approached it and how insiders spoke about themselves. The villages learned that telling their own story would not correct the public one. Silence became easier than argument. What survives the legend? Legends are durable, but they are not complete. They preserve shock. They erase process. What survives beneath the Angel Maker's label is a record that resists neat framing, one that shows how violence can hide inside care, how delay can multiply harm, and how extraordinary acts can grow out of ordinary pressure when nothing intervenes early enough. Chapter 19. What the state did, and did not learn. When the trials ended and the executions were carried out, the state treated the Nagyrév case as finished. Files were closed. Sentences were served. The scandal faded from daily headlines. What remained was a belief, quiet but powerful, that the problem had been located, named, and removed. This belief was convenient. It was also incomplete. Punishment without diagnosis. The state responded to the poisonings as it was structured to respond to crime, by identifying offenders and imposing penalties. This response was decisive, visible, and ultimately limited. What it did not do was treat the case as diagnostic. No inquiry examined why suspicious deaths had gone unchallenged for so long. No investigation asked how many warnings had been ignored before the letters of 1929 forced action. No attention was paid to the structural conditions that made domestic poisoning a workable solution inside ordinary households. Punishment substituted for understanding. Rural medicine left unchanged. One of the clearest lessons of the case lay in medical absence. For years, deaths had been certified casually or not at all. Villages lacked resident doctors. Illness was managed at home. Midwives and neighbors filled the gap left by the state. This absence made poisoning possible without detection. Yet after the trials, there was no systematic expansion of rural medical oversight in the Tisazug. No permanent medical infrastructure followed the scandal. No new protocols for investigating sudden or repeated deaths were introduced in a way that would have altered daily practice. The conditions that had allowed arsenic to masquerade as illness remained largely intact. The state intervened dramatically, then withdrew. Domestic violence remains private. The trials acknowledged domestic violence only as motive. They did not treat it as a problem requiring intervention. Men who had beaten or terrorized their families were not retrospectively examined as failures of protection. Their violence entered the record only because they were dead. Nothing in the aftermath suggested that women would receive earlier protection from abuse, or that reporting violence would be safer than enduring it. The lesson absorbed by many was the opposite, that the state noticed households only when something extreme had already happened. Violence remained private. Care without support. The case exposed the weight of care carried by women in rural households. Elderly relatives. Disabled men. Sick children. Long illnesses without relief. This labor appeared repeatedly in testimony, but it was not addressed as a policy concern. It was treated as background, as something women naturally managed until they failed. There was no effort to redistribute care, support caregivers, or create alternatives to indefinite domestic nursing. The expectation of endurance remained unchanged. A system that relies on unpaid, unsupported labor does not correct itself by punishing those who collapse under its weight. The convenience of gendered blame. By allowing the case to settle into the angel maker's narrative, the state benefited from simplification. The focus on female perpetrators deflected attention from institutional failure. The problem became deviant women rather than delayed intervention, absent medicine, or unaddressed domestic harm. Once those women were punished, the story could end. This framing reassured the public that the danger was exceptional rather than systemic. It also ensured that similar conditions elsewhere would not be examined with the same urgency. No accounting for delay. Perhaps the most striking absence in the aftermath was any accounting for delay. Why was the doctor's early request for exhumation refused? Why was a confession treated as an isolated event? Why were repeated deaths allowed to pass without scrutiny? These questions were not pursued. Delay was treated as unfortunate rather than consequential. No responsibility was assigned for the years during which poisoning could continue without challenge. Without accountability for delay, the same pattern can recur. Closure as strategy. The state closed the case decisively because closure itself was a strategy. A prolonged examination of causes would have required acknowledging that the poisonings were not an aberration, but an extreme expression of pressures common in many rural regions. It would have required investment, reform, and sustained attention. Closure was cheaper. It allowed the state to return to ordinary governance without confronting uncomfortable truths about how much suffering had been absorbed into private life before it became scandal. What was learned informally? Despite the absence of formal reform, the case did produce informal learning. Authorities became more aware of the possibility of domestic poisoning. Forensic arsenic testing became a known tool. Future cases elsewhere were sometimes approached with greater suspicion. But these lessons were reactive rather than preventive. They addressed detection after death, not protection before it. The enduring risk. The conditions that produced Nagyrév were not unique to that region. They exist wherever domestic life is treated as sacrosanct, care labor is taken for granted, violence is absorbed into routine, and rural oversight is thin. The case offered an opportunity to examine those conditions openly. That opportunity was largely declined. A story declared finished. By declaring the case closed, the state allowed the legend to stand in for analysis. The poisonings became something that happened once, somewhere else, long ago, committed by people unlike everyone else. This framing protected institutions from scrutiny and left the deeper causes intact. What ended was not the risk. What ended was attention. Epilogue: what remains when the story ends? After the trials, the executions, and the headlines, what remained of Nagyrév was not a lesson neatly learned. It was a record that resisted closure. The poisonings did not end because understanding arrived. They ended because arsenic was found, graves were opened, and the state intervened with force. By that point, years of death had already been absorbed into ordinary life, explained away by illness, age, drink, and misfortune. The record that survives is incomplete by nature. Some deaths were confirmed as poisonings. Some were suspected but never proven. Some were never examined at all. This incompleteness is not a failure of historians or courts alone. It is the inevitable result of delay. When domestic crime is investigated years after the fact, certainty decays along with bodies and memory. What can be said with confidence is limited, but sufficient. Poison was used repeatedly inside households. It was administered by women to people they lived with and cared for. It persisted for years without intervention. It fit the routines of care closely enough to pass as illness. These facts do not require exaggeration to be disturbing. The women involved were not uniform. Some were abused. Some were exhausted. Some were calculating. Some were frightened. Some acted once. Some acted more than once. Understanding this variation does not soften the harm. It prevents the story from becoming false. The men who died were not uniform either. Some were violent. Some were controlling. Some were ill. Some were dependent. Some were children. Any account that allows one category of victim to stand in for all others collapses under its own weight. The most enduring feature of the case is not poison. It is delay. Deaths were noticed and dismissed. Warnings were raised and ignored. Confessions were contained rather than examined. Each delay allowed the practice to continue. Each refusal to intervene taught the same lesson, that what happened inside households would remain private unless it became impossible to ignore. When intervention finally came, it arrived as punishment rather than protection. That distinction matters. Punishment responds to harm after it has occurred. Protection interrupts harm before it becomes fatal. The Nagyrév case demonstrates what happens when a system relies almost entirely on the former and neglects the latter. The legend that followed, the angel makers, made the story portable but shallow. It offered villains rather than conditions, shock rather than process. It allowed the case to be remembered without requiring change. This manuscript has resisted that flattening. Not to excuse, and not to sensationalize, but to keep the record honest about what was allowed to happen and why it could persist for so long inside ordinary life. Nagyrév was not an aberration created by a handful of monstrous women. It was a place where domestic life absorbed violence, care absorbed exhaustion, and silence absorbed warning until poison became workable. That is what remains once the story ends. Not a parable, and not a curiosity, but a warning that requires no exaggeration, that when suffering is treated as private, and endurance is mistaken for stability, harm does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a cup offered as care, and is buried with relief rather than alarm. The danger is not that such a thing happened once. The danger is believing it could not happen again. Bibliography. Primary and archival sources. Hungarian Royal Court of Justice, Károlyi Törvényszék. Trial transcripts and indictments relating to the Nagyrév and Tiszázug poisonings, 1929 to 1931. Szolnok County Archives, Hungary. Szolnok County Health Authority. Forensic Reports and Exhumation Records, 1929. Hungarian National Archives, Magyar Nemzeti Levelta. Civil Registration Office, Szolnok County. Death Registers and Parish Records, 1900 to 1929. Local Parish and Municipal Archives. Contemporary newspaper coverage, 1929 to 1931. Pesti Hırlap, Budapest. Coverage of the Nagyrév trials and exhumations, 1929 to 1931. Arizona Estate, Budapest. Investigative reporting on the Tisza poisonings, 1929. Magyarország, Budapest. Court reporting and editorials on rural crime and arsenic poisonings. The New York Times. Hungarian Village of Poisoners, and related articles, 1929 to 1930. The Times, London. Foreign correspondence on the Angel Makers trials, 1930. Scholarly and historical works. Bodok, György. A Szonyák a Maregal, a Tiszaügyi Arzen Mérgesek Társadalom Történet. Women and Poison, The Social History of the Tisza Arsenic Poisonings. Budapest, Akadémiai Kiadó, 1998. Hungarian, Foundational Social History Study. Farkas, György. Arzen es Igatagszolgáltatás, a Nagyrévi Perek. Arsenic and Justice, The Nagyrév Trials. Szolnok Historical Review, Volume 12, 2003. Kada, András. Violence, Care, and Constraint in Rural Hungary, 1900 to 1935. Central European Historical Quarterly, Volume 41, Number 2, 2009. Kovacs, Maria M. Gender, Authority, and Law in Interwar Hungary. Budapest, CU Press, 2011. Popular History and Secondary Syntheses. McCracken, Kristin. The Angel Makers. London, Vision Press, 2013. Wilson, Colin. Written in Blood. London, Grafton Books, 1989. Notes on Sources. Victim counts vary across sources due to differing evidentiary standards and retrospective attribution. The term angel makers originates in the popular press and does not appear in court documents. Many Hungarian language sources remain untranslated. Reliance on English summaries risks distortion. Julia Fazekas' personal motivations are not directly recorded in any primary source.